In this video, I'm going to be going through the material graph briefly and showing you a few different techniques that you can use to achieve greater detail and realism from your products. So, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to apply glass to this jug just as a base material for me to work around. And I'm going to double click the jug over to the right hand side and select material graph. It's a bit big. I'm just going to reduce that down in size. And what I'm going to do actually is increase the size of the library window on the left. This is just going to make a little bit of space for me to put my material graph. So the material graph is just a visual way of showing you all the options that you're changing on a specific material. So at the moment you can see these options here: transparency distance, refractive index. They're exactly the same as over here on the right. Got the textures and labels tabs. Textures and labels tabs is exactly the same. But what we do have are these nodes. These nodes are little boxes connected by these blue lines. This just shows you how everything's connected, and I'm sure it will make a little bit more sense as we go through. So I can right click in the background. This will get the options up that I can import into the material graph. So if I go down to textures, I want to add noise fractal and insert that into the bump of the glass. So if I double click on the glass now and go over to textures on the right hand side, you'll see that that noise fractal has been inserted here. So it's just another way of putting in these texture maps. I can hit the align nodes button at the top here, and that will just clear everything up. You can see in the real-time view the bump's now been added. And what I can do is, with this node selected, hit C on the keyboard, and this will enter preview mode. You can also hit this button up here, preview color, but this will show you the texture map without any of the other detail, and it's just an easy way of being able to see exactly what you're doing without having to rely on the real-time view to render out. So I'm going to increase that to, let's say, around 75, increase the fall off maybe a touch, and now I'm going to press C on the keyboard once again to take that preview off. So this is looking a little bit extreme for me, so I'm going to reduce the bump height down to 0.05. Still a little bit extreme for me, I think, so I'm going to drop that to 0.03. And I'm happy with that. It's just to give a little bit more texture into that glass. So what I'm going to do next, right click again, down to textures, and I want to add the marble texture map. So you'll notice if I click and drag that into the bump, the connector between the noise fractal and the bump is now going to disappear. So I need to right click on the connector, down to utilities, and I'm going to add the bump add utility node. This just means that I can now plug in that noise into bump 2, and it's just going to combine them together. So if I select the marble texture, see it on the keyboard so I can see exactly what I'm doing, and I want to reduce that right down. Just want some lines across the glass. I don't want them to be so wobbly, so I'm going to reduce the noise as well. And that's looking about right. So let's see on the keyboard, let's see what's looking like. Again, it's too extreme for me, so I'm going to reduce that by half. I think that looks a little bit better. So next up, if I click on glass solid, you'll see the roughness is set to 0. So there's not going to be any material out there which is going to be exactly perfectly smooth, which is what this is implying. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get some variation going in the roughness. So I'm going to right click, textures, add granite, and I'm going to plug that into the plus sign of this glass node. It's going to provide a few more options, and one of them is roughness. So you can see in the real-time view that's now a bit more cloudy. If I preview, I can reduce that right down, maybe move the texture around, and you can see that, well, hopefully you can see that changing. So if I hit Control Shift R on the keyboard, that's going to bring up the render region tool. What this does is it just means that the real-time viewer has been reduced into that tiny little box. So if I hit H on the keyboard as well, that's going to bring up this heads up view. And this is going to show you how many samples, so it's going to be a good representation. If I take that render region off, my frames per second is 3.4. Put that render region on, and suddenly my frames per second shoot up to around 20. So this is just going to render out a lot quicker, and you're going to be able to see more subtle details like the change in roughness more easily. So I still want it to be fairly smooth. So how I'm going to change that is I'm going to right click on this connector, go down to Utilities and Color to Number. This is going to make the color from the granite change that data into numbers. So the 0 representing black, if I go to preview mode, and 1 representing the lighter areas in white. So if I increase 1 to 1.5, that's going to get a bit brighter. Black being 0 means that we want it to be less rough, so I'm going to reduce this all the way down so it's a lot darker. Let's keep it around, let's say 1.4 is probably about right. Take the preview off and it's a lot smoother all of a sudden, but it still has variation in roughness. It'll be hard to see at the moment, but once it's fully rendered out, it makes a big difference. So next up, we're going to add a label. And to add a label, I'm going to need a new material. So I'm going to right click, go to Materials, and Plastic Transparent. I'm going to plug that into label, and you'll see everything else has now disappeared. So let's just put this plastic transparent material over the top of everything. And what we want is for it to fade upwards into that glass material that we've just worked on. So how we're going to do this is add the color gradient and plug that into opacity. If I change the plastic transparent so it's easier to see what's going on, let's change that to an orange. And I bring up the color gradient preview, drag black across. So black's going to be full opacity, white's going to be opaque. Turn off the preview. You'll see that the left-hand side, which was white in the preview, is now that plastic, yellow transparent plastic, and the right-hand side is the glass that we were working on before. So it's the wrong way around. I want it to come up from the bottom. I'm going to go back into preview mode, and I'm going to change the gradient type to spherical. So you can see if I reduce that down even further, it's just going to be a sphere, and everything outside of that sphere is going to be black. So it doesn't really matter what size it's going to be, because I'm going to use the move tool, just move that sphere all the way down to the bottom, and turn the preview off. There you go, you can see that the colors fading in from the bottom. The other thing that the problem with this is that it's also going to fade in these bump maps and roughness maps that we're working on. We want them to be included in this material as well. We're going to click Control, and we're going to select all these nodes that we were working on earlier. Hit Control C, Control V, select them all again. Let's just copy and paste them, and plug these in to the plastic transparent. So the color to number gradient was roughness, and the bump add goes to bump. And that's just going to make sure that the bump and the roughness is all going to transfer onto that plastic material as well. Last thing that we're going to do is the geometry nodes. I'm going to just make a bit of space here. Right click, geometry. So we're just going to add some bubbles into this glass. I'm going to plug that into the geometry. nothing's happened apart from this little button at the top. So this is the execute geometry nodes button. It's exactly the same as over here. Once I've pressed it, bubbles are going to appear in this glass. I'm going to double click on that. Let's reduce the size down a little bit. Maybe have a few more. I mean, only needs minor tweaking. I think it looks all right already. But you'll see the button comes up at the top right again. No changes are made. You just got to press that. This will execute geometry nodes and it will recalculate and put those bubbles in. So as you can see, it slowed down the file. So I'd recommend, if possible, to always do the geometry nodes last, because if we look, I will disable this, execute geometry nodes to get them out. If we look in the heads up display, without it's 71,730 triangles. If I enable that and execute geometry nodes, it increases by almost 100,000. So this is just going to slow down the file. I mean, 170,000 shouldn't be too bad anyway. But if you start playing around, especially with the displacement, you start playing around with that, then those triangles quickly go up to the millions. And I'd recommend, if you're gonna be using these displacement geometry nodes, I would recommend to either disable it and then re-enable it at the very end just before you render, or just leave it till the very end. I might give this original glass a little bit of color. The glass, it just needs a very slight dip into the color, and I think that's about done. So I'll let that render out, and I hope that was helpful. It's taken you through a few different techniques: geometry nodes, utility nodes, texture maps, mixing in different materials in with the material that you started with. And if you have any questions at all, then just leave them as a comment and I'll get back to you.